With US President Trump threatening to impose the strongest sanctions in history against Iran, how will the EU maintain its support for that country if it risks a strategic war with the US? And after Nicolas Maduro wins another 6-year term as Venezuela's president, what chance does Maduro have fixing the disastrous economy faced with more US sanctions? Welcome to The Point. I'm Chen Lei, sitting in for Liu Xin. The US has vowed to impose the strongest sanctions ever against Iran, a move that some say may be aimed at regime change. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Monday unveiled the new Iran policy a week after the US pulled out of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Within hours, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani fired back at Pompeo, asking, "Who are you to make decisions about Iran?" The EU's foreign policy chief Federica Mogherini dismissed Pompeo's speech as irresponsible, stressing there's no alternative to the JCPOA. So, will the new sanctions crush Iran? How will the EU maintain its Iran deal support? Joining our discussion today are Ghanbar Naderi, correspondent of the Tehran-based Press TV, Jonathan Sacerdoti, a terrorism analyst joining us from London, and Professor Doga Eralp from the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C. Before jumping into the discussion, let's listen to what Pompeo said Monday.
The sting of sanctions will be painful if the regime does not change its course from the unacceptable and unproductive path it has chosen to one that rejoins the League of Nations. These will indeed end up being the strongest sanctions in history when we are complete.
Right, let's get back to our discussion with our guests. Let me ask you first, Jonathan, observers say the 12-point laundry list from Pompeo is so impossible that it basically says diplomacy is out the door. What do you think?
Donald Trump's White House is clearly playing things differently, not just in the United States, but across the world stage. And some might say that those 12 things are impossible, but others would say that those 12 things are blindingly obvious, and that what Donald Trump is doing is resetting the balance here. So after 8 years of Obama in the White House, culminating in what Trump has called a disastrous agreement with Iran, Trump is literally pulling the tablecloth from under all of the settings on the table and hoping everything lands back in balance rather than there being a giant mess afterwards. Now, like when magicians do that, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But what Trump is actually saying here through Pompeo's speech is really a statement of fact. All of that shopping list of things that Iran is doing wrong on the world stage, those complaints that the international community do in fact share with America about Iran's behavior, none of those are particularly in dispute. What's in dispute is whether or not Iran can be brought back into check and back into the community of nations around the world behaving in a more regular way, stopping sponsorship of international terrorism, stopping the development, covert or otherwise, of nuclear weapons, stopping threats to countries like Israel, its close neighbor.
Professor
all of those
Eralp,
things that are being requested are not out of line, really.
Is this magician's trick going to work with Iran?
Well, if this trick had worked, it would have worked earlier, right? So the reason why JCPOA in the first place was designed was to try a new trick, right? That's a good combination of rewards and sticks. So obviously, in the previous 3-4 decades, what we'd seen, the sanction policy on Iran had not worked. On the other side, it further consolidated the grip of the hardline clerics in the Iranian regime. So I'm pretty clear that Secretary Pompeo is aware of that. So it's not necessarily about forcing regime change in Iran, but rather giving a clear message to US allies in the region like Israel and Saudi Arabia that US is firmly behind their positions and policies in the Middle East against Iran's influence in the region.
Jonathan, do you think the punishment, that sending out that message, is the strategy? Or is it really regime change?
Well, I think let's not put too fine a point on this. Donald Trump, America, many countries across the world would like to see regime change in Iran. But that's not the primary aim of what they're doing now. It may be a secondary aim, but regime change, as we know, is very hard and can result in quite a mess. What they're trying in the first place is to do all the things they felt should have been done in the previous agreement with Iran. And it's worth noting that the sanctions before, which were crippling, did in fact work. They brought Iran to the negotiating table because its economy was suffering so enormously. The fact then remains that what was negotiated, in my opinion, and it turns out in the opinion of the current White House administration, was not really good enough. It didn't stop Iran developing nuclear weapons. It simply kicked the ball into the long grass. There was a sunset clause which says that after some time they would basically be able to resume their activities. The Israeli intelligence haul that they spectacularly got out of Iran, all of those documents taken out of the country showed that they had not got rid of their plans on how to build nuclear weapons. They'd simply put them away in a place that they thought was secure. Not secure enough, obviously, with the Mossad and Israeli intelligence able to get hold of it. But it shows that Iran was never acting in good faith in a way that would suggest that they were going to stop their nuclear weapons development. They were simply delaying it until they were allowed to carry on.
To what happens next. The European response has been mixed, fairly tepid reaction from Germany, France, a bit more indignation, opposition. Is it feasible that the EU will be able to compensate companies for these US sanctions?
Well, obviously, European Union found itself between a rock and a hard place, isn't it? European Union has now have to emerge as the voice of reason in the international arena. But while doing it, EU also has to find a way, some sort of a compromise with the United States that it would still be able to protect the interests of the European companies in the United States while still upholding the JCPOA deal. So that obviously is a difficult case, as we've seen recently with Total's announcement that it's going to withdraw from the deal that it struck with the Iranian government earlier. So obviously the burden would fall rather on the shoulders of the prominent EU governments rather than Brussels. So in the coming few weeks, we would expect to see more determinant moves by some of the European leaders to protect the Iran deal.
Do you think it's feasible that the EU will be able to stick to the deal, Jonathan?
Not really, and I think that that's another interesting feature of what's happening here. Donald Trump is making decisions on the world stage that might seem unpopular with other countries. This is one example, the scrapping of the JCPOA. Another is the moving of the US embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, acknowledging something that had been talked about for decades in the US. What's interesting about these sorts of foreign policy moves is not that they come from a lunatic president, which is the accusation from many. It's that in fact America is resuming its position of leading the world. And while the European countries in particular might not want to follow on either of those cases, but specifically we're talking about the Iran nuclear deal today, they may find that they have to, because while they're trying to negotiate with Iran in order to keep those very lucrative business ties that they're in the process of resuming after the sanctions were dropped, they may find that the punishment from the US, and that's been made very clear to them, it may be painful for them, but if they're not with the US, they're against it on this. They may find that they have to choose between Iran and the US, and I like to think that the European Union and European governments, however strange in some of their foreign policy behaviour, will know which one of those is their true ally and which one of those is their true trade partner. So ultimately, this all comes down to money, and that's something that Donald Trump really understands.
Ghanbar, I know you're joining us via phone from Tehran. I'm not sure if you heard what our guests were just saying, but Iran is asking Europe to create the conditions which would encourage private companies in the EU to function in Iran. Is that possible, and what does that entail?
Well, this is a very complex situation for the time being. We don't know how Europe is going to react, whether it is going to stand against the pressures, imposed by the Trump administration. But at the end of the day, we have to think about our own national interests. And as our president made it absolutely clear yesterday, who is the United States government to tell us what to do and what not to do in the Middle East, let alone in our own country? They want us to sit down again for negotiations and start all this, theater all over again and trust the United States. How is it possible to trust the United States? The same regime that a couple of days ago, its president did exit from the nuclear deal and violated a deal that was sanctioned and ratified by the UN Security Council, and at the same time endorsed by the rest of the UN Security Council member states and the EU and plus Russia and China. This was a huge win-win deal for everybody, for the international community, and it was for international peace and security. But the Trump administration decided to walk out just like that. and now they are expecting us to listen to them and and do exactly 12 demands that they are making from us, which, by the way, it is wishful thinking. Iran is not going to forego its national interest, let alone leave Syria or Iraq, just as the Trump White House wants us to do. We were there to support them in the war against terror. We will leave if they want us to leave. But at the end of the day, Iran is not going to trust the United States again and deal and write another deal with them or sign them.
So, Ghanbar, is this going to move Iran closer to China and Russia?
Absolutely. We don't trust the West. We don't trust the European Union, because they are going to do what exactly America wants them to do. But China and Russia have independent policies. China stood with us. China helped us to sign that nuclear deal, reach that important agreement. Russia was standing beside us when they tried to impose sanctions on us at the UN Security Council. So we trust these two nations only. They are our number one allies, and we'll stick to them. If they want us to do something and they ask us to do, we will do it, because we know that at the end of the day, they mean good, unlike the United States and Europe. And they are reliable partners. When America imposed so-called crippling sanctions against us a couple of years ago, China has been here for more than 20 years. Chinese companies have been here for more than 20 years. They are doing business with us. We trust them. We are doing business with them. It's a win-win business for all of us, and we are more than ever willing to continue this lucrative business with them. But if it is about European Union, they have to prove at the end of the day that they can be trustworthy and they mean business, and they actually do it in real terms without accepting any demands from the United States. We have to wait for a practical reaction from the European Union. We haven't seen that.
I want to ask Doga, can Chinese companies and Chinese demand quickly step in, considering the fact that Chinese Tokyo gear maker ZTE is still paying the price for going against those US sanctions against Iran?
Well, obviously, it's up to the Chinese corporations to decide what type of business strategy they would follow. So that also boils down to, again, going back to the earlier statement regarding Trump's strategy, which obviously playing hardball business negotiation tactics. So this would show the extent to which U.S. administration's choice of strategy, playing hardball not only with Iran, but with China, along with European Union, would pay off what they expect it would. So we'll see that in the coming months.
And finally, Jonathan, what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, it's impossible to know exactly what will happen next, but I would imagine that the EU, despite its protestations at the moment, will fall in line more with what the US wants, and that despite Iran complaining that the US can't dictate these things to them, they are going to begin to have to change at least the way they speak rather than necessarily the way they act. But ultimately, with the US under an administration that is willing to talk tough and potentially act tough, there were hints of suggestions that there may be military action taking place. Iran got emboldened by what Barack Obama did, specifically in releasing money to Iran.
Do you think war is possible?
We just saw recently that the Iranian, well, certainly the Iranians have already launched 32 missiles from Syria into Israel, all of them shot down by Israel that were coming its way, and they flew an unmanned drone into the country that was also, according to the Israelis, armed with weapons. So it certainly looks like
You're
Iran
very
is
pro-Israel.
for
We do
war
know that.
and threatening other countries. Sorry?
We know that you're very pro-Israel.
Well, pro-Israel, you can call me pro-Israel if you like. I think that if Iran is launching rockets or unmanned aerial vehicles with weapons on them towards Israel, you don't need to be pro-Israel or against Israel to see that as an act of aggression towards a country that is not in any way threatening Iran except for its own protection. So you may call me pro-Israel. I think simply I'm seeing things as they are in the area. And Iran is taking that position not just with Israel, it's taking positions across the whole of the Middle East in order to try and show its strength around the region. America says that it's had enough of that. Pompeo's speech had a list of things that he expects of Iran, and they were all to do with Iranian
that's all we have
aggression,
time
from actions
for
like
this
that to developing ballistic missiles.
Complex topic. We still have another one to get through. Thank you so much to our guests. We've got Jonathan Sacerdoti joining us from London. He's a terrorism analyst, and also Professor Doga Eralp from the School of International Service, joining us from Washington, D.C. at the American University. And on the phone, we had Ghanbar Naderi, correspondent of the Tehran-based Press TV. The Point will be back in just a moment.
This is CGTN.
You're watching CGTN. I'm Jeff Moody, live in Beijing.
You're watching CGTN.
Coming to you from Washington, D.C.
You're watching CGTN.
Coming to you from my room.
I'm members of this
Mark, what can you tell us about events happening there?
politics.
This is a pretty picture. Time you can see
Back over to Beijing.
To go after them.
All about the
This is CGTN. CGTN. See the difference.
Venezuela's leftist leader Nicolas Maduro won a new 6-year term on Sunday, but his rivals have alleged voting irregularities. Turnout was just 46.1%, way down from the last election's 80%. The opposition said the real figure was close to 30%. Victory for Maduro could trigger more Western sanctions as the country grapples with an economic crisis. It is in the 5th year of recession, there's falling oil production, and Venezuela is seeing malnutrition, hyperinflation, and mass immigration. Both the country and the state oil company are in default. So what happens now? What chance does Maduro have of fixing the economy? And would Western sanctions bring about regime change? With me are Phil Gunson, a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group, joining us from Caracas, and Dr. Dany Bahar, a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution, joining us from Washington. We also have Victor Gaujakai joining us from Macau by phone. I want to talk to you, Phil, because just 46% of the electorate turned out to vote, which appears to reflect both opposition boycott and supporters' disillusionment. What does the low turnout mean for the future of the Maduro administration?
Well, I think it means that President Maduro clearly represents a minority of the electorate. It's probably weakened him not just in relation to the country as a whole and to the international community, which, as you say, much of which regards the election as illegitimate and is, in the case of some Latin American countries, recalling ambassadors for consultations as a result. But I think it also weakens him internally, in the sense that his rivals for power, perhaps within the ruling coalition, people who are unhappy with Mr. Maduro's handling both of politics and of the economy, might feel emboldened to try to replace him, even though ostensibly he is a re-elected president. I don't think his position is very comfortable. As you say, his performance on the economy has been extremely poor. The country is facing very, very severe economic and financial crisis, for which Mr. Maduro doesn't appear to have any solution. He hasn't got a plan beyond continuing with the same policies that have created the situation we're in now.
Dany, it's said that the election could trigger new Western sanctions, but I've also heard that it doesn't need to be new Western sanctions because banks don't want to lend to Venezuela anyway, and oil production is down anyway. What do you think?
Yeah, that's correct. I think that more sanctions are going to come up, but you know, the worst of all sanctions is the one that the government has summoned upon itself. The government has mismanaged the country in such a way that even if there were no sanctions whatsoever, they wouldn't been able to they wouldn't been able to get funds from the international community or from the international financial system, because it's a very unreliable borrower. It's very clear that they're unable to repay the debt. So why would you or anybody else would give them money to such a bad borrower? So it's not about the sanctions, really. It's about the mismanagement that has become the worst of all sanctions.
Dany, you're a Venezuelan, and many Venezuelans have been quoted in Western media saying they're disillusioned and angry about the election. They criticize Maduro for economic hardships and the opposition for the dysfunctional split. You were recently in Cucuta, the border with Colombia. Is that fair comment, or does it show Western media bias?
Well, no, the situation in Cucuta is very real, and it's the result of people who are just really fleeing the country because they have no enough food to eat, they have no medicine to treat their diseases. So you really see desperate people who are leaving and fleeing the country, trying to find a new life in full of uncertainty, because the people that you're seeing fleeing the country are people from very low socioeconomic backgrounds who have no savings whatsoever, and they're just going somewhere to try and make a life from scratch. And this pattern, I think, it will keep increasing as long as there's no real change in the country, which would involve changing the government. But this government is has put all of their efforts to stay in power as long as they can, just for the sake of staying in power, not really to help the Venezuelan people. So you will expect to see much and more refugees leaving the country in the next few months and years.
Phil, do you think there's nothing that the president can do to fix the economy?
Oh, I think there are plenty of things.
Yeah,
that
there's one thing that he can do, which is to resign.
Remember that President Maduro has been in power.
I'd like it when guests fight over who gets to talk first. But Phil, you first.
What I was going to say was that there are plenty of things that Mr. Maduro could do to fix the economy, but he's been in power since 2013, and he's had many opportunities to begin an economic reform. It seemed on one or two occasions, particularly close to the beginning of his first term, that he was going to do that, but he never has. And I think the fact is that on the one hand, he doesn't really understand how an economy works. He has very little idea. He's advised by people who are extremely ideological and who don't believe, for example, that the massive increase in the money supply in Venezuela has anything to do with inflation. And on the other hand, he's also not, unlike Hugo Chavez, his predecessor, who could pretty much snap his fingers and take any decision and have it implemented. Mr. Maduro has to find a consensus somehow within the ruling coalition, and there doesn't seem to have been a consensus for economic reform, partly because some of Mr. Maduro's allies are making a great deal of money out of the distortions in the economy.
Right. Let's talk to Victor, who's joining us from Macau, and talk about the China aspect, because governments around the world are rejecting the election results. China says it would not interfere in Venezuelan politics, but didn't send congratulations, because back in 2013, China sent congratulations immediately after the election. Victor?
Well, it's apparent that the situation in Venezuela is at a turning point. There are major problems inside Venezuela. And Venezuela is also facing pressure from the many countries in the international community, especially from Western countries, in particular the United States. However, I would say it is exactly at difficult points like this that people in Venezuela really need to put a premium to stability. Now the general election is over. I think it is time for the people to rally around the new leadership, whether you like it or not, and put a closure to the election process, because otherwise, if the internal struggle drags on, it will create more instability, and it will make the whole economic situation, which is already very bad, even worse in the coming months and coming years. And I think people in Venezuela need to guard against the huge risks of foreign forces interfering in the situation in Venezuela. Whether Mr. Maduro won the election or not, the United States will not be happy with him. And the United States wants to get rid of him. Whether it is the United States business or not, that's another thing.
Let's talk about the $19 billion that Venezuela owes China, where the grace period ran out last month. Will there be a default, and what happens to the relationship if Venezuela just ditches that debt?
Of course, China faces huge risks in the loans and the huge investments in Venezuela, especially in the oil and gas sector. However, I think China needs to deal with Venezuela on a very long-term basis. We do not need to lose our sanity over the ups and downs of the situation in Venezuela on a daily or monthly or even yearly basis. I think China needs to bite the bullet and stick around in Venezuela for the longer term. And I think the Chinese government is actively renegotiating with the Venezuelan government for the huge investments. It's apparent that the Venezuelan government does not have enough money to repay for all the loans that they have incurred, and also they are defaulting on some of the major oil exporting transactions. However, I think we need to see the hope. Oil price in the world is coming up, and it is time for Venezuela to get its acts together and for the government to really devote itself to national development rather than wasting more time in this internal endless struggle, political struggle,
Dany,
sometimes fueled very much by
Let me bring it back to the
intervention.
plight of the Venezuelan people, because as many as 1.5 million have left Venezuela over the past 2 years, mostly for neighboring countries. Although they have been generous in helping the Venezuelans, nobody in the region is calling this a refugee crisis. There's even discrepancy about the number of people leaving, and based on a recent discussion at Brookings with aid agencies that you had, Dany, I don't see the $1.5 billion you say that's needed coming out of anywhere.
Are you asking the question to me?
No,
Dao?
to Dany,
right,
Dany
not
Bahar.
yet. I think that I think that not yet, and it's a very important sum of money, so it's not going to be easy to gather that amount of money or something smaller. I think, though, that on the ground you're seeing the governments of Latin America really coordinating and trying to put together the efforts to understand the situation. I think that the reason that the numbers are so there's no consensus on the numbers because a lot of these people who are crossing the border are doing so without a passport, because there's simply a lot of people in Venezuela without passports because the government simply don't have even money to print passports. Correct. Yeah, correct. I don't have a passport for more than a year. And so it's very hard to take those numbers. The government of Colombia is doing a great effort on putting together a census to understand the numbers, and I think it's going to be clearer within a month what is the actual number of Venezuelans in Colombia, and that will give us also a better idea of the region.
Thank you so much for all our panelists. Phil Gunson, Senior Analyst at the International Crisis Group in Caracas, and Dr. Dany Bahar, David M. Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution from Washington, and Victor Gaujikai joining us by phone from Macau. That's going to do it for this edition of The Point. A lot for you to digest, I'm sure. You can download the app called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. I'm Cheng Lei, subbing in for Liu Xin.